change. We're looking for feedback. And then number 6 is policy direction. So I'm not going to stand up here and tell you exactly what our policy is going to be. And even in our Braille plan, we'll have a policy direction, but it's really up to the CTB, it's up to VCRA to carry out many of the policies that we're going to be discussing. So this is 1/6 is the actual direction. So today's goal, I want to focus on climate change, station policy, equity policy, and service policy, and go through some of the existing conditions, guiding documents and industry trends, and our impetus for change. So, why are we even looking into these things? So I'll review some background for key policy topics. I want to hear from you all. Did we miss anything? Are we on the right track with the proposed direction? Great. That goes without saying. So climate change policy, I'll just dive right into this, existing measures. So the Secretary talked recently about how transportation affects climate change and how climate change affects transportation. So I did this yin and yang thing because it's really, it's hard to tell where one ends and one begins. But for the rail industry and for our programs at DRPT, what we do know is that our rail projects have BCAs. We have a benefit cost analysis that looks into climate change issues, effects on the environment. We also already do National Environmental Policy Act documents, environmental impact statements that have requirements to assess and avoid sensitive resources and calculate, minimize, and mitigate other environmental impacts. And then, of course, rail projects consistently score really well for environmental factors in SMART scale for air quality, impact to natural and cultural resources, and congestion mitigation factors. So we know already that rail as a mode is good for the environment comparatively. We know that there are fewer greenhouse gases that are emitted. So that's the data. These are some of the existing measures that we're already familiar with. And then data development, you all heard about the greenhouse gas emissions work that DEQ and KPMG and VDOT are working on. And of course, the transportation accounts for 29% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we have in the state of Virginia. So how do we move that needle when it comes to rail projects? When rail only takes up 1.7, if you look at the graphic, 1.7% of that overall 29% of greenhouse gases. Is that 1.7% going to move the needle? How we do what we do within rail? It might, it can. There's always room for improvement, but maybe the obvious solution that I see is that mode shift is the answer. And we shy away. I mean, we talk about mode shift in our programs. We talk about mode shift for our BCAs for grant programs for freight, but we aren't very loud about mode shift when we don't want to be comparing ourselves rail against truck and car. There's a need for all of those modes. We want to make sure that we're diversifying. So talking about mode shift could be and really highlighting that and moving toward it could move the needle on climate change policy in the big picture.
I don't know. I'm assuming there's a lot of straight body, and that's what I was wondering.
So, how we change policy direction? I want to make sure that we're focusing on freight, as you say, and the changes that are happening in freight. In the rail plan, we're seeing a shift from coal to intermodal, and so that's definitely a trend, and it's something that we need to pay attention to and capturing. So investing in projects to support that mode shift to rail, whether it's passenger but then also freight, is important to us. We want to continue to collect data that grantees that shows our progress in that regard, and also investing in projects that avoid and minimize the effects of climate change on risk. That's the other side of the yin-yang. So projects that are focused, so we work with the EPRA and the railroad to make this making sure that the projects will be elements to them that prevent washout, flooding, and we also want to pay attention to the key orders and how we can avoid, down that liability. The situations where you just have to slow down. So how can we have programs that so our grant performance measures can help push the rail industry toward investment in infrastructure and maintenance, because that those key order issues be a situation where additional maintenance could have an effect.
And highlight that, especially in the context of the shift that we're seeing in freight. So Emma mentioned that coal traffic is falling off, container traffic is increasing. I believe that June and July of this year were the two largest trade imbalances in the history of this country, which means we got more freight coming into the ports. We're seeing that the congestion we have getting out of the ports right now. So that trend's going to continue, I believe, sadly for U.S. manufacturing, but it does make that more of an initiative that we should focus on, because the old railroad infrastructure was key primarily to coal, with freight that is, of course, part of it, but it wasn't really aligned with what we're going to be experiencing in the coming years, with ports being the centers of all activity.
So, we just keep in the back of your head somewhere that up in the 1960s, practically all mail and express in the United States moved on trains. The first several cars of almost every passenger train were mail and express. Now, that was before FedEx, UPS, Amazon, whatever. And I'm not suggesting that we try to get all mail back on trains, but I do think that moving containers of express and mail by train rather than truck has great potential. So, and of course, every container we move that way, we're getting it off of 95 or whatever. So, let's just think about what the state and what Mary said, they get on the offense here a bit. What can we do to encourage that kind of behavior?
We do have good leadership. We especially like certified male certified. And also part of what is being at industry clusters that are that have close proximity to rail. And we have a sheet now actually that shows some of those where we can really really focus our efforts with regional people. That's the direction. So I'm happy to take more comments, and I'm happy to take comments by email me or that's what I want to talk about that we have with regards to we do have rules and regulations regarding equity and procurement, DBE goals, small business goals. We have Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with our public meetings and other activities that we comply with. For NEPA projects, for environmental impact statements, we do assess and avoid environmental justice communities and minimize and mitigate impacts. And we also have ADA priorities for stations. That's all the stuff that we're doing and we have to do. We know we need to go beyond that, of course. Those are the guardrails. Yes, exactly. I was really happy to hear Jen DeBrule's presentation on the transit division's transit equity and modernization study. So I'm going to be following that very closely so that we can adopt as much as possible of the good ideas that are coming out from that transit work on the rail side. But obviously there's more to do, and I have some ideas here about direction. So one thing that is within our wheelhouse, within our purview at DRPT, again thinking about how to move the needle. DRPT and VRPA grant applications for funds can require adherence to equity priorities. It's something that we can address more clearly in our applications and our requirements for those grant programs. We can use data to identify underserved communities that don't have access to rail. That's something that we do when we have NEPA projects. We look at environmental justice communities and have some really good mapping that helps us identify how best to mitigate any impacts, but then also look at access issues as well. We can use that for access issues. We can focus on this with benefit cost analysis that could calculate equity benefits by pinpointing underserved populations that would result in greater access, that would benefit from greater access. We can consider fair pricing structure that meets the needs of all income levels. And then one of the big ones that we're dealing with right now, as Jennifer mentioned, recognizing the history of disproportionate negative impacts of freight and passenger rail projects to communities of color and low-income communities, and work to mitigate the ongoing effects and prevent future negative impacts. So that's something that we all see. I mean, where are transportation facilities located, where are rail yards located? A lot of them already exist, but what can we do about it now?
question about the chicken and the egg in the last report. Yeah, I live in I'm sort of an expert on this. I'm here. And it was there when everyone else came, right? Leverage point box, NIK, everything else. And it was not, they didn't go put it into a low income community. They put it where they put it in the communities developed around, including my community. And is it, did we do it, as we look back at certainly Virginia, did we locate rail yards in low income communities, or those low income communities grew up around rail yards because other communities didn't want to be there?
I think it's both. I've seen examples of both. For example, Shockoe Hill, the railroad wasn't there when the graveyard was put there. It came later, but then with redlining, there are definitely lots of examples of communities that grew up around industrial areas, rail yards, because that's the only place they could go.
And we don't really like the gold dust, but we like the economic activity. And part of our
Mm-hmm. I'm familiar with your neighborhood too. Everything's in one place, right? Mm-hmm. Right. In the backyard. So yeah, there's a lot. These run the gamut for sure. Thank you for your feedback. So I can turn over to station policy if you'd like. Obviously, we have a station policy. We had it for the last rail plan, for the 2018 rail plan. It was very comprehensive. It touched on everything from adding new stations to an existing route, modifying an existing station on an existing route, adding a new station where service doesn't exist. It included service expansion, and then all the costs to think about. And that's what this slide shows, all the costs to think about. Now, one thing that our previous rail station policy did is it really separated state responsibility from local responsibility. So you might remember on this graphic there was a line, and everything on the track side was really focused on the state level, and then everything on the right-hand side, stations connectivity, was seen as a local responsibility. And it's still that outlook hasn't changed that much. It's kind of it's logical. It makes sense. That's where we can have the most effect, is on the operations platforms in capital side for the trains. We also, this time around, now that the landscape has changed, we at the state have more of an ownership responsibility. We want to look at costs as a whole when it comes to new stations and station improvements, and maybe even consider some a local match rather than separating the types of costs. Think about it in terms of a percentage match, and look at the station as an overall entity, so that you can't have one without the other. I think that this slide would also be in order to get that on how
Safe. Sorry.
Thanks. Right. And so consistent quality and passenger experience that's something that we definitely want to deal with. Um, we have a new landscape now with this ownership paradigm, and so whereas we used to get well, we still get a lot of questions about new stations. Our focus has really shifted to existing stations and what we need to be doing at existing stations. So especially now with this ownership paradigm, our top priority for funding and what we're paying attention most to is ADA compliance at stations. And as Jennifer mentioned, we have that matrix of stations, and there are a top three that we're focused on right now that are those orange stars that you see on the map. And then moving on from ADA compliance, ensuring a state of good repair at stations, capacity improvements for additional planned service as transforming rail in Virginia comes along and we're adding more trains. We need to make sure that the stations are big enough and can handle more passengers, and then that consistent quality passenger experience. So we have funding to do some of these things. VPRA is actively working on these items, and this is a real focus of our station policy right now, in addition to looking at new stations and looking at them more holistically. So that's the direction that we're going right now with stations. And just as a time check, it's 8:43. I want to know how much time you want to leave for rail banking, too. Okay, so with that said, then there's a little more time for discussion on station policy. But real quick on the rail banking, like I said, the presentation is kind of it's a little bit textbooky. So yeah, I think you'll be able to get a lot out of it. So any comments on station policy direction? And one nice thing is this list that you see here, this came together as a collaboration with Jeremy, who's now with BPRA, and the rail planning team. And so we've been working very collaboratively. The list of policies we came up with in one room, with BPRA and DRPT. That is definitely a goal, and in some of the policies, DRPT has a little more control over than others, like our grant applications and our metrics, our BCA. Mhm. Mhm. Sure. Mhm. Yes. Well, and I switched over to service policy because that's a good segue. Okay. But don't want to cut off conversation on stations. Um, but that, yes, we are doing a Commonwealth corridor study as part of the rail plan. It is due to the General Assembly a little later than some of the studies that we're working on right now, but it's in the works, and we'll be able to talk a little bit more about it in December. Some of the results of that study, but we're looking at cost estimates, what the ridership could be, what the condition of the track is, and how we can get it up to snuff for passenger going east west. So service policy was really included in our 2018 station policy. That was part of the policy. We're looking at it because of the shift that we've had with station policy, looking at upgrading and state of good repair ADA for existing stations. We thought that service policy could be its own standalone category for policies. So service expansion beyond end of the line stations, that's one of the service policy topics. Additional frequencies along an existing route, and really transforming rail in Virginia. That initiative has established this formal timeline for new service in the 2016 and 2030 horizon. So we know what we're going to do. We kind of have a service policy that Transforming Rail in Virginia set out for us. So because DRPT is involved with more of the long-range statewide planning, we're looking at our focus kind of beyond that, because this is already in the works. Mm-hmm.
Jennifer, I want Scott and Jennifer, I wonder what Rick Mormon and Ted Butler say in that regard. Two Norfolk Southern, the chairman and the senior person who runs the PRA. Saw that the other day. Yeah, but they've got a different, they've got a unique perspective that they bring to it. That's the way they came from. And he ran it, okay? And he's not that far gone. I mean, he's been out for a while, and Deb's been out. That's my point. They're on the VPRA board. So it'd be interesting to hear their. That's what I'm suggesting. Because they got more experience in rail than.
Okay. So service policy direction. So we're looking at post-transforming rail in Virginia, post-2030, at the long-range service expansion plan that we want to develop in collaboration with BPRA and have approved by the CTB. But of course, BPRA will implement these and direct the funding. So questions to consider. We, of course, our guardrails, the comprehensive rail agreements that we have with the railroads. We want to make sure that our plans are consistent with the FRA regional rail plan. There's a Southeast regional rail plan that FRA put out last year, Amtrak's corridor vision plan, VTrans, and the statewide rail plan. So, and understanding what costs are, what the benefits are. As Jennifer mentioned, this Commonwealth corridor study that we're doing, the study that we're looking at for service down to Bristol, things that aren't in transforming rail in Virginia. We want to make sure that we understand the operating and capital costs of those extensions, what the benefits of those extensions are, and have some metrics that we look at so that every time somebody studies ridership and revenue and capital costs, are we comparing apples to apples? And we've been doing more of these studies more frequently, so we're getting a little bit of a better system going on comparing ridership and cost estimates. So that's a good development. Would these services serve underserved communities? Does it create network efficiencies? Are there network efficiencies that we can see for freight and also for existing passenger? What impact would it have on freight fluidity? So often, and you'll see we've been working with Norfolk Southern to see what impact stop at Bedford might have on network fluidity, and so those partnerships with the freight railroads, understanding what their issues are, is huge. And then of course, what impact would this service have on existing passenger services? Are we cannibalizing other services? Are we robbing Peter to pay Paul? Make sure that we're actually meeting needs that are there efficiently. So any thoughts about these questions or service policy? Sure. So, and having folks on the VPRA board is who are knowledgeable of this is great. We also participate in a freight advisory committee that is run by the Office of Innovation with Kathy McGee, and there are a lot of our freight partners, short line partners, are part of that group. And so we've been talking to them about our policies and some of the data that we've been seeing. We took some of the data. The freight data that Jatinder collected and showed us yesterday, and talked to them about the trends that they're seeing, trying to ground truth some of that and figure out what do we do with it. The same questions that you all were bringing up yesterday with those freight partners. Oh my goodness. Thank you very much. Good to see you. Thanks for your comments. Take your time, right? Rail's important.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's your step in